My illustrious colleague George Shebok used to say, "To seduce without to love is a crime." So one has to find the right level of honest and sincere seduction through the piece and not for ourselves in the transmission towards the audience. Because if not, it's self-serving, and in this case it's only serving the muse. Fauré served the muse and we serve the muse, and the audience tastes the muse. Gabriel Fauré is a country. Gabriel Fauré is a garden. Gabriel Fauré is a state of mind. Gabriel Fauré is a melodic bass, but also a dialogue with the melodic line which doesn't need to reach a climax to justify its expectation and its following. It's an ever-growing and ever-blossoming melodic line which, like Gregorian music, is just narrating its musical and thematic thoughts in a continuous development. The harmonic traveling is always into chords which could appear for what they're not. So it's not always determined. The chords lingering in an expectation, they could go one way or the other, and we don't know. We are in this delicious moment of hope and longing. And what is very important is that every part is meaningful. In the 6th Nocturne, the first section in question, it's more about presenting the garden and probably the atmosphere, rather. Of the tonality tonality of D flat major is very often the case for Fauré in his art songs, Mélodie, where he uses G flat, A flat, D flat. It's a key that is extremely elegant and noble. It could have sounded as well in C major. Like sunset and sunrise, poetically, the humans put in a humanistic involvement in it, or the smile in the dog's beautiful face. It's what we project in the elements or in nature for our psyche that matters. So we could project that C major is a more plain key, and D flat major it's a more complex key because of the tonalities flats. But for relative pitch it is more or less the same, and in any case, even with perfect pitch there are different tunings, so everything is just a question of inner ear rather than outside ear. Is how we choose a tonality is to do with how we choose a partner, or how we decide by intuition that this is the right place to be. I think a composer most likely doesn't have always, except in some symbolic cases like Mozart towards the end of his life writing in 3 flats or 3 sharps because of the Holy Trinity and his involvement in humanistic movements. But that again is a statement. In this case is a choice. And I think that in the Nocturnes, Fauré explores the pianistic resonances of the past. Obviously Chopin for Nocturnes is the probably template for him, but he goes out of it very quickly, just like all composers come from somewhere, but there is the grain that makes them only them, that is so recognizably them, without to reject the influences, but just who they are. And in the case of Fauré, his music could be emotionally performed with expressive waves and become a little bit more expressionistic in the sense of second Viennese school, for instance, with Berg, and have the feeling that we have an emotional roller coaster, and here it could be the grande ligne, the line that drives us towards the horizon, the chosen note, la note choisie, which is so important with the melodic bass. For instance, in this case, its own volution, its own expression, its own movement. Of course, some are harmonic because of the circle of fifths and the dominant and the tonics and other degrees, but it's not a harmonic bass. If not, would have been, and then perhaps banal, and I'm sorry I even give this example, but often these examples to show what and how or why the composer rather didn't choose it is very revealing, even if disturbing, obviously, because it's belittling the mastery of the composer's thought. But the composer's thought in case here by Fauré is a question of a line that starts and is like Roman days aqueducts that have a very small percentage of the nivellation that allows for the water to trickle all the way to the city from the given well, and that whatever valleys or whatever rivers it has to go over, they build this kind of bridging system with the arches that allows for the top to just glide very continuously. And I often think of this analogy with Fauré's melodic line because of the lack of spontaneous need for climax and drop and rise and drop, as I said earlier. It is more about the continuous expression of a melodic line that is highlighted by different harmonizations from in out and continues, a bit like a smile, sometimes darker, sometimes happier, but it evolves like as if we watch a beautiful landscape with a different cloud changes and weather changes, but it's the same landscape that changes its character because of the environment. Monet painted several times the cathedral, the face of the Rouen Cathedral, in front of different times of the day, and shadows, lights, or both, give a different almost personality or reflection to it. And so you could say that, well, obviously when I play Fauré, since my teacher studied with Fauré and she insisted on melodic bass and all these elements I just mentioned, it does not mean that those elements define it. In fact, they don't. They only make it more trivial. What really defines my inspiration playing Fauré and teaching Fauré is about the fact that it's just like you open the window in the morning and you smell the parfum of the nature, or whatever it is that you are facing. It's not just the eyes, it's all the senses. And Richter used to tell me when I used to study with him that I should smell every second rose in the garden. And so inevitably all the senses are alert. There is a sensuality about this symbolism rather than impressionism of end of 19th century France, and in the arts, in the poetry, and in the paintings, of course, as famously as we all know. And in the music, this kind of subtle transition from one mood to another goes with the harmonic changes. When, for instance, he is luminous in D flat major, as I consider it luminous, then he darkens it like as if a cloud comes, and or would have a flat 6 in D flat major, which is equivalent of A major if it was harmonically to be spelled originally B flat, B double flat rather major. And this little shadow in the brightness of the D flat major, solar D flat major, is just a passing cloud, because he goes from, and it starts on that flat 6 as a real A major. It makes a whole cadence in it. And we think, okay, we modulated in A major, but it's only flat 6 of D flat. And between the melody, so you have the dark, oh, and again the bright. Second attend, and then could it be? And then you explore what it could have been if we had stayed in flat 6. And then very subtly and almost tenderly, reassuringly rather, like for a child and his mom, you're back home in D flat major. So you didn't go far, but you thought you might. It's like a mental escape. Oh, what if I were, but no. And in this case, the melodic line is so beautifully elegant. The bass line is so stately, noble. And so what is in between? Obviously no Alberti bass. That would be a banal thing which he wouldn't do. Though I don't want to speak for a composer, after all it's his choice. But in my vision, understanding and entering in his world, I think that the idea of the sextuplets or triplets influenced by his love for for the harp, not to mention the harpist, daughter of famous Alphonse Asselmans, professor of the Conservatoire in Paris, whose daughter was his companion for most of his life. And in general, I think most of Fauré's inner writing, of the inner structure of the textures, is often harpic, as I like to call it, or harpistic on the piano. We will see that in the later sections of the Sixth Nocturne. But in this first section, it's just displayed almost like sitar, like drops or petals of a rose. And so suggestively nonchalant or sort of relaxed, that does not need a rubato like in Chopin, because it's rhythmically implemented in the 2-against-3 that it connects to melodic line with. If it was. Or even if it was with, let's say, tremolos. Be static, paradoxically, even if it's in constant shaking and shiver and motion of shiver. But this idea of the sextolets that are so displayed between the two parallel melodic lines of the melody and the bass, just subtly hint by a few notes, not many, not thick, not a total harmonization like, for instance, Chopin in the harp etude, opus 25, number 1. Or Schubert in impromptu. With more notes harmonically here or here, compared to this texture, just translucid in the mid compared to the, and it allows for the melodic lines on the bass and the melody in dialogue and in parallel to be breathing. It just just means why I always think of the open window and then I'm smelling the nature. I see the garden, I see the light, I see the rain, I see many things, but I don't have even to see them. I sense them. I sense all these things. I don't have to see them. I can close my eyes and imagine it. But where is this leading me? To the subdominant, yes, and then to the tonic after the dominant. One sentence, I just catch my breath and continue the narration. The bass rises. I try to go to another key, a first attempt. Second attempt, and then that atmosphere, the cloud over the sun. I see how far I can go in A major or a B double flat major. Sometimes when I'm in the airplane above this, on the sky, above the clouds, I can see the reflection with the sunshine over the plane of the plane itself on the clouds, and the plane is contours are shadowed on the white puffy clouds, and takes the texture of the clouds, or deformed by the texture of the clouds, is the reflection of, the impression of, the symbolism of. This symbolism, which was a big poetic movement of the time, in the late 19th century in France, is so much connected to the meaning of Fauré's suggestive music of all these atmosphere of elements, of expectation, of love, of deceit, of desire to elevate one's spirit to a certain higher level of being through the inspiration of love or the inspiration of nature itself, or just the humanity in it. And I must say that all the songs by Fauré are not melodically striking by themselves as the harmonic texture that is embedded in the accompaniment which justifies them. For instance, Clair de Lune. So even without the words, songs without words, like Emilesson in this case, really without words, since of course I'm not a singer, but that the melodic line contains by itself in itself the elegance of the words, the melody, the music of the words themselves, and in this case the meaning of the sounds themselves. It's melodic line which you have in the next section of, or the next two sections of this sixth nocturne, for instance. Or the following section with again harp accompaniment. Itself, a nocturne for piano by Fauré is a lot like Mélodie by Fauré without singer. But that doesn't mean that the without is a lack or a miss. It's more like as if it's a parallel motion to the words. It exists by itself, like the music itself meaningfully speaks to us without to specifically speak to us through the words of the chosen poem. It becomes even more universal. In a certain aspect, you can say that most of Schubert's melodic lines, even in the piano music of his, are part of the lied that he wrote so many lieder. The simplicity or the beauty of the melodic line, like in the last sonata. Like he is, because he is his music. In other words, would he write a song, a symphony, a quartet, or a sonata for piano, he writes a song. And very often one can say that also of Chopin. Never wrote an opera, but in fact always wrote lyrical bel canto. Etc. So in other words, here I can say that Fauré, who's predominantly famous for his quality of writing for songs, and of course religiously with the Requiem, you have the same kind of sense of purity of the melodic line, like the Sanctus. Section. Of his nocturne, he's also proceeding with the same melodic and harmonic dressing as he does in his Requiem. That can be taught for most composers, because after all they express themselves through their own inner world, regardless of the genre, because it's the honesty, the sincerity of the language that matters, of the statement that is in the statement that is said in the piece. And this honesty in the statement is what touches us, because it's ultimately the truth, or at least their truth, that is told. Would it be through sacred music or through a non-sacred music? Would it be for a salon piano work like this Nocturne, or would it be for symphonic works? I think we need to always be respectful of this idea that we don't know exactly what the composer meant. We can always try, as I do, lovingly so, sometimes perhaps wrongly so, because after all one can be misled in one's connection to the psyche of a composer, rather the DNA of their thought, through our own psyche, and perhaps we reduce the composer's DNA thought process into our own capacity to understand, which is perhaps reductive. But well, of course, we study and then we introspectively question until we one day find that perhaps we have found some answer to how things are connected in the cosmic way. Everything sort of like takes its place, and it reveals its meaning, or it reveals the connections that make us understand how this became that, and how this transformed to become this, and in order to just bring us well-being or anxiety or happiness, or these profound feelings that inhabit us all. So after the opening luminous section, he has a string quartet texture C-sharp minor section. Sorry, I slipped on the keys. With this cold weather, my tips of the fingers are slippery. Well, one thing which is very important is for a pianist to be able to hear before to play, and by playing to answer to what the pianist heard. In this case, the textures layered allow for a melodic line first sentence, to be accompanied by a secondary voice with a lower stem C in the right hand, which in fact is a constant syncopation of rather delayed note, which is its own first beat. It's like humming, acquiescing with the melody, or sometimes questioning it, but always being offbeat. So because the harmonies and the melody fit on the beat, this under voice is off the beat compared to the melody, but by itself it's its own first beat. And with the two hands together, you can say that Fauré composes as a string quartet, but Beethoven already did too. Most composers think in string quartet at least as the idealized genre of four-part harmony or contrapoint, and both. And in this case, sometimes even complexly for the pianist, he's repeating the same note between the two parts. Had there been a part, would have been more understood by the listener. But to be clear, the pianist, meaning to clearly translate the voice leading, the pianist has to hold the top part louder and the bottom part softer, even on the same note, and repeat it inside the lifting of the key, like ta-ha, and not, because if it's fully lifted and replayed, it's all sound, and that is wrong, because it's like unifying two parts in one that is fake, or one-dimensional basically, instead of being in depth. Of course it helps to first sing it. Sorry for my singing. Or the opposite. To just separate the notion of these two parts where the unisons collide on each other, and in the performance be able to keep the two colors, rather perhaps, lightness and darkness, brightness and shadows. It's so unnerving, because one can spend a lifetime to search how to subtly voice, suggest and hint on the piano with shadows and light, all these elements, and the pedal rather dosaged correctly, and then the quality of the sound, the color of the sound, the intimacy of it and the projection of it, and at the same time the performance of it with the necessary seduction to the audience, but not too much, because you want to translate the seduction you receive from the music as a transmitter, as a membrane vibrating for the audience. All this, and somebody coughs in the middle of the performance, and then you just shadows everything that you're attempting, even if unsuccessfully, and it becomes like and you're distracted as a performer, and you lose your concentration, and you feel like all these subtleties are lost in their intention, let less in their realization. But sometimes it's good, because it allows for the performer to consider the ephemeral fact of all of that passing attempts, all these passing attempts. And I think that when we reach a point where we are in sort of we let ourselves be on the wings of the phrase, on top of the big bird, and we're just flying over, and things happen, but we are in the process of experiencing this grande ligne, this long line, this melodic meaning to things, even if the secondary voices collide or give a fake or false harmonization, or if not even a whole false melodization, right? Now the accompaniment is made of sort of wet pizzicati, would you say, sound like, with the bass. With this noble melodic line of the bass, which my teacher talked to me so much about for Fauré, who doesn't sit in a, so to say, ostinato sofa and then move to another sofa. He's in constant bass melodic motion that has its own melodic line, even if less obvious to the unexercised hearing of a listener or a performer, because of course we are mostly, after the Romantic era for piano writing, driven to follow the melodic line on the top. And so if we put the soprano and the bass, or violin 1 and cello, where they be note against note. In this case they're off a note. So it reveals itself little by little when you add the voices. Now the tenor, the fact that the cello and viola, if it is, or bass and tenor, play offbeat but are not held like the second violin or alto part, while being equally offbeat. And the melody on top of it, like this luminous, obvious and almost revealed truth. And you hear all of them. But we follow them and through, not only when it's practical, but every bar of the 8-bar sentence. And it is factual that if you focus on one and then alternatively on the other, it becomes confusing as a message, because you would hear the melody and then has to be disciplined to follow here and display all the melodic motions at the same time, as if you follow at the same time several tracks at the same time, and or several dogs that you walk, or several children that you bring to the garden, and you keep your eye on each of them doing different things, but within that unity of place. And I think this is something where the pedal needs to be very subtle, because if the right foot pedal is too long, the sauce overwhelms the salad, and the dressing kills the taste of the different elements of the salad. But if it's too dry, then there is no more dressing to the salad, so it becomes too surgically clean. Most of the teachers post-World War II, and this generation were many of mine, were teaching, practicing the piano and playing it in lesson without the right foot pedal. It's like the ultimate temptation to avoid, and to be able to substitute fingerings to the point to which you get rid of the necessity of the pedal until the concert, where you can indulge a little. And so in the performance or in the practice or the lesson, you would have to practice to be eloquent, elegant, legato, phrased, meaningful in your design, in your line, in your colors, but without the pedals, included the left pedal that goes without to say for this generation. But it's also to do with the fact that the pianos were terribly not as good as today in terms of the industrial production of quality concert instruments, and it's just commendable to imagine the quality of touch control Lipati had to play on the kind of pianos he was playing when we hear the recordings today, and they seem to be so amazingly gracefully, almost easily in that sense of grace, phrased, voiced and organized. But in fact there are very difficult actions to play because of course humidity and many things happened in the world wars, and the instruments didn't really carry well themselves, and so to create a sense of atmosphere or even a dosaged diminuendo. I remember a D minor Bach concerto in a live recording in probably therefore mid-40s, if it was, I think, before his early death at age 35 in 1950 of Lipati's. He was playing this well, that is an A. It happens to be that I used now the unicorda to enhance my diminuendo towards the drop of the chromatic descent. Used the pedal on one unicorda pedal on one of those erreurs or players on which he played in his last Besançon recital, which is so famous for the waltzes by Chopin and the first partita that he gave a few months before his death. You would think, wow, that takes a lot of control for the sounds to do what you want them to do in the infinite intuition, but also subtlety. Today's pianos are so much more, in terms of action, reliable in terms of general concert venues with very good instruments. So they do play mostly for you, the pianos, rather than you have to control their unevennesses in the action. Of course, one has to always think about that, because you have to let the texture speak, but you want there to be also sometimes the pedal that goes with the acoustic, that allows for a little halo that gives this atmosphere, as I said earlier, about how you smell the garden in the morning is not the same as in the evening. What is terribly true is that the melodic line in the next section also or in this darker section you always hear the melodic note of the next note of the sentence alone for a fraction of a nanosecond, and then you have the accompaniment either here in offbeat or here in delayed arpeggio. And this way the melodic line doesn't have to fight its accompaniment in terms of balance, orchestration of the piano, rather, on the piano. The elements are heard because there is a sort of transparency in the texture that allows that. So in the opening given too, this lack of thick accompaniment texture allows for the melodic line to be isolated by itself. So you always can follow the melodic line as this this luminous situation where you just follow, you're seduced by the melodic line, typically the word, and the harmonic or the contrapuntal texture does not overwhelm the melodic line. Sometimes the melodic line is so beautiful in Chopin, like in the fourth ballade. intonation development. Or really strong pinky to sustain the incredible driven energy of the accompaniment with these elements of lament by two, like Bach. Of course, if he was piano friendly, he might have given it to the thumb, because it's easier to voice and have the accompaniment on the top. But of course, he didn't care about that, because he wanted to have the melody like in the operas that inspired him. In the top, of course, soprano. And therefore you have to be able to play all this intense texture of accompaniment, but within a level of transparency that allows for the song to breathe, therefore for the section to be heard. And so as beautiful, as elaborate, as complex the accompaniment, or so to say the dressing rather than the accompaniment by itself, it is of course constitutive of the whole piece. You cannot just eliminate it or track it away and say, okay, well, just compartment the one and the other, put it in separate tracks. No, they need to be interlaced. They need to bring each other their sources. They need to embrace each other, sometimes collide in the beauty of a collision. But obviously Fauré thinks as a string quartet writer, and he manages to leave breathing space for the texture to be followed by the performer and hopefully the listener. Bach often in his contrapoint uses this one talks, one acquiesces. So obviously when you play, this one listens, and then, so it's alternatively busy and listening. And then when he has the stretto moment, he would be together. They both talk at the same time in order to reach a point at the conclusion of a climatic moment. This kind of dialogue of the muses, Fauré doesn't really do. It's not so much a dialogue, is in this case of the sixth nocturne, it's continuous narrations that you follow at the same time. And because of this subtle texture that allows it to be not overwhelmed by the richness of the harmonic progressions or the inner voicings, of course depending if also they're layered so higher in a hierarchy of importance by the performer, then they reveal themselves to you and you start seeing this kind of imaginary world appear out of nowhere, of the silence. Obviously all music starts and ends with a silence, but all of a sudden it creates a monument which is ephemeral and atmospherically unforgettable, and you go, oh, I'll never forget this piece, it meant so much to me, and it's gone like let's say cloud in the sky. Even if you see in the cloud the projection of your imagination, it's only what it is and only what it was, and it's gone. And the beauty of it is it's passing as well, not that you can photograph it every day and just watch it. And I think the evolving in the interpretation in a piece like this is also not to freeze it in one understanding, nor did my teacher ask me to do so. I'm just constantly rewording in words what it means to me when I teach it, as well as I teach it, also to teach it myself, because obviously I have to apply to myself all the unbelievable discipline that my teacher taught me to have towards myself, and then to allow tolerance towards the others when they have a different point of view, rather than criticize all the others and find justifications, perhaps sometimes by weakness, for one's own faults. But that said, the second section, or the one which has this harp motion, on the bass line, which has this kind of incredibly beautiful upwards leap of octave compared to the melodic line, which is mostly stepwise. And then and the harp in the middle. This kind of writing asks for a melodic broadcast, projection, and inside the accompaniment pattern you have to subtly hint the motion that appears to be like in minimalistic music, almost always the same, but just slightly so differently evolving that your attention span is sort of deliciously triggered, and you hear it's not just a simple arpeggio of D flat major. It has a semitone that adds to the little like a little color to this very clear let's say perhaps transparent D flat major arpeggio, and then inside it you have a pattern in the accompaniment around the fifth of the D flat triad in sixth position. Of course, if you're too demonstrative, then it sounds so busy. Then when the melody really comes in and the bass is brought out, you're distracted, in fact, at that point as a listener through the pianist by all these beauties that are happening, even if they're expressive by themselves. So in order to put the hierarchy, you have to still keep all of the, let's say, bottom parts clear, hinted, played from inside the key rather than from above the key, and let the melody always prevail. And because the piano as an instrument is an instrument of decay of sound, you have to pick up the exit of the long value under the dynamic where it has dropped by the decay, and you follow it and you pick it just where it left, and you bring it up again for the rest of the phrase, so that you have the illusion of a continuous vibrato on the E, like string player, wind player, voice singer. And if you use only the accompaniment to obtain that crescendo, which is one of the solutions, it does interrupt the melodic line's decay, because it overwhelms it, as if the wave goes over the sandcastle and all of a sudden the sandcastle is sort of demolished. Or at least the idea is to be able to use the accompaniment with the eloquent bass, melodic bass, but never to the detriment even of the drop of the decay of the melodic line. So you have to be very cautious to pick up the note after the long value in the melodic line under, and then re-establish the volume level of the original note, so that you can have this illusion on the long run of a continuous melodic line being broadcasted with length of sound, which is a big I guess imaginary word that pianists have to always think of, is projection of the length of sound. And never complain about the piano. Oh, this piano doesn't have nice stops. This piano is too heavy. This piano doesn't this. Of course, most pianos don't have most things that we like them to have, because our ideal of the sound is like an architect who has a blueprint in mind when he sees an empty space and imagines virtually the building even without a computer-generated few-dimensional project. It's in the eye of the architect. It's like in the ear of the conductor who imagines the structure construction of the orchestra symphonic, let's say, if it is balance of the different instruments. It's a question of following your intuition too, that the melodic line doesn't die, shouldn't die, won't die. And it's not going to be revived only by the busyness of the accompaniment, whether the accompaniment will help the flow, the motion, the busyness, but under the melodic line. And so if I continue... So this section number 2 into the development using the two elements of section 1 in C sharp minor and number 2 in D flat major with a harp style song. He does it in a relatively classical way, using portions of each of the melodic thematic elements and then putting them together or against each other until they build up to the, in fact, climax, not melodic like I mentioned at the beginning, but rather dramatic construction, like architectural climax, which is the arrival point after the bass, almost like organist bass. The opening line in the bass, arriving on again flat 6, the A major or B double flat major chord. After which he does his short recap of the opening section, starting from that chord of A major or B double flat. And then again, reassuringly, deliciously, welcomingly, warmingly, almost huggingly, he returns to D flat major. You feel like you're back in the room, you're home. comes the second time after all this development that brought us to so many psychologically high points. As a listener, we've been in a very epic narration, and we're like catching our breath after all these beauties being displayed, or these strange things being told, or these intense feelings being displayed. When the same section was in the opening, we just started it all fresh, and we heard, we felt like almost like in a sunrise, if it was. And the last time, the same elements sunset, and just an elevation of the spirit, but in diminuendo, as if you're just flying away, or floating away, in seemingly endless sentence of endless secondary harmonies, and ultimately D-flat, and with a sense of abandon. So we have voicing of the tenor, of the bass, of the soprano, just like a duo at the end of a beautiful opera where the two lovers hold hands and sing to each other tenderly. Of course, it's dangerous to be too aware of all these elements, because then we still have to keep always in mind the melodic line first and foremost. Sometimes I feel like Ulysses needing to be tied up on the pole of his boat so that he doesn't get tempted too much by the mermaids in the island where they cross with his boat. But then if you do that, you don't really live intensely the beauty of the piece that you want to transmit to your audience. So you have to find, after all, not a way to shut down the emotion that overwhelms you, which overwhelms you, but to be able to dosage the elements so that they all contribute to this elegant flow, and you let the listener make their own journey with the piece. You don't have to just spoon feed them too much. Too expressive, not that it's too much, but it takes away from this gentle elegance that so justifies this Nocturne's mood. Read in things what one wants to see in them. It's always in the eye of the beholder. In this case, I would say that what is striking when you work on a piece like this, or when you think of it, or you teach it, or you record it, or you just try to tell it to yourself at its purest, is that it brings you the satisfaction of having being closer to something more elevating than yourself. And it's generally the transport of the lift of art that brings us to higher levels of our consciousness, even as a listener, regardless if it's as a performer in this case, or perhaps a performer as a listener plus, and not just a doer and a maker. And the industry of playing shouldn't overwhelm the meaning of what the playing brings to us before we started or after we played. After we learned it. All these elements have to blend, and the piece appears to exist, as my teacher used to say, outside of the composer's, of course, presence, it becomes only this beautiful sphere or element or fact that we look at on for inspiration, and that we try to serve our best, and it's there luminously by itself in the air between performers and teachers and scholars, perhaps today more than ever. In this way of compartmenting the studies in music. But let's say that in one way or another the piece is a gift to humanity, without this perhaps cheesy sentence, but I think of that as such, that they passed by like Fauré and left us something that will, like great composers, painters, thinkers, left us, or architects left us, which are ways of being only, not ways of doing, and that brings us to elevate our own spirits to their levels. And their own humanity was probably not much higher than ours, and not to self-deprecate myself or all of us, but I think it's given to many humans to have a moment where they're elevated higher than their own condition through their art or through their doing or through their convictions. And whatever it means to us after, away from that time period or away from that context, just the work by itself brings us a sense of meaning or accomplishment, or closer to beauty, even if it's a hard work to serve it right, with humility. I believe that the notation is our only connection to the masterpiece, and therefore sometimes we read in it what we would like to read in it. I'll give you an example. The meter of the 6th Nocturne opening section is in 3/2. Nobody would have guessed, and I think it's purposely so, because it starts even with a very slow upbeat, so it's a half note upbeat of 6/8 notes in triplet. This is 3, this is 1 as a beat, this is 2, and then this is 3, and then the next bar is 1, 4, 5, and 6, if you count the beats in the hypermeter, and 7, and then 8, and then 9, breath, and we start 1. So you have a 9 half notes phrase, which is started on an upbeat, so becomes 10. The point of it is that he writes in the notation visually for us to see these bars that are almost as long as the line of the paper allows for each of the staffs. And so we feel already by the visual aspect of it that is extremely stretched, and that it drives us to search for this line, this driven direction of the phrase, the eloquence of the meaning of where we're going, or where we would like to bring our audience with. Take you by the hand and tell you my narration, and follow me on this path, and marvel yourself by what you see, what you feel, what you smell, what you hear, and what you imagine. And it doesn't have to be what I imagine, it has to be what it will be meaningful for you to imagine. But it is true that the visual contact with the masterpiece often is sometimes deceptive, because we don't hear it in performances, or perhaps because the way it's written it doesn't translate. I recall in the same noble key of D-flat major having been as a child shocked by the notation of the D-flat major Nocturne by Chopin. Which, like most masterpieces, we hear before we read, because of performances, concerts going, or people playing for us, or in situations where we hear some people play, regardless if it's concert or at home or in some guest situation. And I always heard da da dee da da dee da dee da dee da. The accompaniment of the 6/16 notes, if they were to be 16th notes, divided by 3 times 2, so da da dee da, which corresponds to the pacing of the melodic line in its pulse every 8th note. score, and I was starting to study it at some point, I was realizing that the design of Chopin's accompaniment pattern is not done by 3 times 2/16 notes, but by 2 times 3/16 notes, by the fact that the thumb drops from the F. So he chose an inner design of elegant detail, like a lace, which is in 2 in fact. And so the melody begins in 3, it becomes a hemiola, and therefore the accompaniment has its own pulse separated from the melodic line. And this duality of pulse, in fact, gives more propulsion to the melody. Of it vertically dropping together on each melodic note. It doesn't make it less beautiful, it's just that it makes it not paced the same way, the steps are not the same. The delayed the different subdivision of the beats in the 2 hands allows in a slow tempo for something more emotional but also motion. And I think in a more, let's say, another example of the same would be the first variation of the Goldberg variations, but in this case more driven and dynamic. Sorry for this. The left hand is in 3. Meaning 3/8 notes a dotted quarter. Like a cello suite would be yum da da dum pa dum pum pum, and the 3/4 of the right hand is 3 times 2. 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. And left hand is 1 2 1. So if the one has to become the other in order to be together, it will sound. If the left hand keeps its 2 times 3, and the right hand is 3 times 2, it becomes. If I demonstratively want to show the different pulse that comes not together in the middle of the bar, but every 2 pulses is together. So here, 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 but in between. Or in 109's Beethoven's variations in the second movement, he has this 9/8. So the melody is. If he was going to subdivide this 9/8 into 3 times 2, he would have done. By step of 3/16 notes twice instead of 2/16 notes 3 times, which would correspond to the 8th notes of the melody. But he does. So the melodic design of the accompaniment suggests the impulse which is inside itself, so it gives its own volution, which becomes then nourishment for the different pulse of the melodic line, instead of trying to verticalize the 2 and in a way impoverish the pulse diversity, not only melodic diversity with the contrapoint of the voices, but contrapoint of, so to say, polyrhythmic, if it's a bit of a heavy word, but perhaps a contrapoint of pulse, and then you start hearing these patterns that are not corresponding, rather nourishing each other by their own pulse. So the right hand in Chopin can display itself as if ignoring the right left, which has its own inner life. It would have been. I don't even want to start again, I'm sorry for that. Banalization, for example, of why it shouldn't have been what it didn't. What it wasn't, but what it could have been if it was simplified. And in fact, this complexity is not the beauty of the piece. The beauty of the piece is the simplicity of the melodic line often, or of the bass line in this case in Fauré. But it's more about the way you express yourself in a noble way, which is you don't display your richnesses, you keep them for your soul, and you just project your goodness to the others, but you don't project to the others all what you have as a display of virtuosity for pianists or richness for rich people. No, it's not a question of that. It's not, oh, my music or this music is more rich in its texture, so I have to show you everything. You have to show what how the elements in fact interlace in order to produce the graceful moment, and not make it heavy by too much explanation. Of course, when you teach, when you conduct, you explain these elements as I just did, and they become an awareness that perhaps clogs the simplicity of the intuition of the melody which you had before. As sometimes one can think that ignorance is bliss because you are not aware of what you do, but you do it. And when you become so aware of all these elements, perhaps then you're inhibited of doing it because you cannot perhaps manage them at the same time: the harmony, the melody, the color, the phrasing, the breathing, the pedal, the direction, the line, the tempo, the sound, the instrument responding, and perhaps the stage fright. All these elements overwhelm your hearing, and all of a sudden the listener doesn't hear the obviousness rather than simplicity, but perhaps they say, think of the melodic line. That should prevail, and the rest should be just follow and flow. Thank you.